What's up, gangsters? It's a cold and blustery day out here in the middle of nowhere at Rube Goldberg Industries, but at least the sun is out. And it is another one of my favorite kind of days because I get to do a video about a completed project. And yes, I know I just did one last week or the week before, but this is just the way it's worked out. I had 2 or 3 projects going all of last fall that just weren't moving to completion very fast. And towards the beginning of December, I just felt like I wanted to do something that was just purely for fun, that I felt like I could complete pretty quickly and have just total creative freedom on. And as it happened, as I may have mentioned in part 1 of my case, Thunder Models case VAI video, I had that kit from Kitmaker Network that Jim Starkweather had sent me. Hell, I don't know. He probably has it on a spreadsheet somewhere earlier in the year, much earlier in the year, that I just had not gotten to building. And part of the reason was because I just didn't have a good solid idea in my head about what I wanted to do with it. I knew that I wanted to do a simple little vignette with a workshop, but beyond that I hadn't really fleshed it out. And so I just kind of had to get to a point where not only was there an opening in my schedule, but I had a more clear idea of what I wanted the piece to look like. So anyway, I got to that point in early December. And I jumped right into it, and it was good fun. The case VAI kit, as I showed you guys in part 1, is a pretty simple, straightforward little thing. People get kind of blown away when they realize how truly small it is. But not only is it 1/35th scale, so it's just not huge to begin with, but the case VAI is a tiny little tractor. I mean, the thing is basically a glorified garden tractor, and so it's little bitty. And so the thing is 2 sprues plus a tiny little bit of photo etch and a couple of tiny little decals, none of which I even used. So it's simple. What was a little more complex was the vignette or the diorama, whatever you want to call it, that I wanted to construct around the tractor. But I think it came out pretty good. And I'll talk about what I did and how I did all that. But first, let's take a look at what I accomplished. Okay, so there you go. That's the thing. I don't really know where to start, but I guess I'll just go with the tractor, since that's kind of the focal point. Hopefully you guys were able to see what the story was that I was trying to create, which is that this little tractor has been pulled into the shop for some maintenance, specifically that it gets a new right front tire. And I was pretty stoked with the way this worked out. I got the LZ resin wheels for this thing, which on the back was just the tire, and it uses the kit rims. But on the front, it's a complete wheel and tire that's all molded together, and you can kind of see that over here. But that left me with the kit rims and tires, and there really is no better way to show a representation of a brand new rubber tire than these vinyl tires that come in these kits. I mean, it just, it's already got the right texture and look and everything. So I just went ahead and painted and weathered the kit rim for that one and popped the tire on there, and it went on pretty easily. But the front wheels are one of a couple of places where I felt like the engineering on this Thunder Models kit kind of fell down. It has just this short little stubby thing that the front wheels go on, and I think I can probably show you that in the instructions here. And it's just aggravating. There's a good picture of it right there. You can see you just don't get much of an axle stub, and it's aggravating when these guys do this, because it's like they've never built a model where they had to put wheels on it, and they wanted to be able to dry fit the wheels and have it sit there on its wheels, so that you could position it in a diorama or whatever it is you need to do. And I don't really understand why it's so difficult for these guys to put a longer axle stub on these things. But to be fair, it's not just Thunder Models. This seems to be a common thing. I mean, I even had issues with when I built my Tamiya Porsche a couple of years ago. Same thing, barely any engagement on the axles. And that just kind of, to me, defies common sense. I mean, sure, you got to have a little bit of taper on it because of draft, and that may not make it fit quite as tightly as you want to, but that's a simple engineering problem to overcome. So I just don't feel like there's much of an excuse there. The other place where I felt like the engineering was just a little bit rough was, oh hell. I had this on the top of my head. I was actually mentioning it to somebody just the other day. Oh, the fenders. If you look at the rear fenders, let's see. There is just not much engagement. Okay, there it is. You can see that you put that little bracket on the bottom of the fender, and it goes into a little slot there. So they give you a tab and a slot, but the tab is literally like, I don't know, it's less than a millimeter tall. So you really get no engagement. I mean, you absolutely can't just put the fender on there dry and expect it to just stay put. And installing the fenders after they were already painted and weathered and everything, and not having good engagement there made it a little bit of a frustrating exercise. And obviously I got it done, but that's just another one of those things where I feel like a little bit more forethought would have made for a model that was easier to put together. I never did get this left fender to stand up perfectly straight. In fact, when I was looking at the photographs a little bit ago, I saw one where it was obvious how crooked it still is, and you can kind of see it from that angle that it leans to the inside a little bit. And I just, that's just honestly because there's not good engagement down there at the bottom of it where it plugs in. So anyway, I don't normally talk about the sort of issues with a kit until after I've covered how I did everything, but you know, there it is. And that's really about it. I think that this is honestly a pretty well engineered kit otherwise. And with the exception of the fit of the hood, which I talked about in part 1, being a little bit tight over the gas tank and not being able to get it on quite perfectly, I think that the fit, the molding, the engineering on this thing was really pretty good. I think it's a kit that I would recommend to anybody, especially if you like tractors, given that there are not hardly any tractor models out there in any scale, much less good ones. So if you like tractors, definitely get it. Obviously, I chose to build the civilian version with the case kind of orange-red paint, but this, you know, I think a lot of people are going to want to build the military option. But anyway, speaking of the paint, this is pretty much 100% Mission Models acrylics, which I really like a lot. I did a pretty lengthy test on those paints last year, and it's good stuff. It's one of the only paints I've ever found that you can brush paint just as easily as you can airbrush it. The only issue that I've had with it is that it chips super easily with hairspray. So you have to be really careful how much hairspray you get on. And I struggled with having little enough. In fact, there were several places where I ended up just scrubbing the paint off and starting over, and in fact did not use any hairspray at all the second time around, which, as I thought about it later, I remember that Rinaldi talks about using it that way in his latest book. And it works pretty well. It produces a little bit of a different effect when you do it without the hairspray that I like a lot. You know, with this paint, well, really with any paint, you get more than one mechanism of paint degradation. It's not just chipping. Obviously, chipping happens in places where there's a lot of wear and abuse. Sorry, I keep bumping the camera, but places like these, like the floorboards here, that obviously is going to be a place where paint gets chipped. You know, any place where there's going to be any kind of abrasion. But there's a lot of other places on a vehicle that's been sitting out in the weather where the paint just gets oxidized and faded and abraded by wind and blowing dirt and whatever, you know, whatever it is that causes the paint to just eventually become thin enough that you can see right through it to the rust. And what I was after with this tractor was exactly that. A tractor that had been in use for maybe 10 years, because this diorama is supposed to be happening in like the late 50s. But I wanted the tractor to reflect one that had been in use for maybe 10 years, but that had been sitting out in the weather, not stored in a barn or anything like that. And so it would have a lot of that just basically faded and thin paint. And so like on the seat, that's what I tried to depict. And you can see kind of how nicely that chipping effect without any chipping fluid worked. Basically, all I did was just get after it. Well, first I sprayed it pretty thin. I was strategic about spraying it very thin in the areas of highest wear. But then I just got after it with a stiff little brush and some water and just scrubbed on it. And it really works nicely. It's a technique that you kind of have to experiment with, but I like it. I did the same thing on top of the hood here. This also has kind of a multi-layer thing because I wanted to show a little bit of gray primer there. And that gray primer, which was actually just Mission Models light ghost gray, I think I mixed in a little bit of black to darken it up, but it does not have any chipping fluid on top of it. And you can see those nice small chips that I was able to get there with some scrubbing. Same thing on the tops of the fenders. And I like the way that method left a larger amount of paint next to those stiffening ribs on the fender. Hopefully I can get in close enough and the camera will focus there. But you can see kind of how it let the paint collect more in those low spots, which again I think is pretty authentic. I think that, you know, that reflects the kind of things that I see on some of the worn tractors on our farm and on other places around where I live. So I like the effect. What I ended up doing on these was I was at the point where I realized that the hairspray I had on there was just too thick, and so what I did was I just took a wet Q-tip and scrubbed it off of the tops of the fenders and then all the way kind of down to about the midpoint, and then left it on there in the lower part so that I had some actual chipping on the bottom portion of the fender. You can kind of see it down there, and then more of the worn and faded look up on top. So anyway, that's kind of the story with the chipping and fading on the paint. The base is just my sort of what's become my standard rust base, which is a mix of Stynylrez primer colors to get a nice dark rust base, and then I use the Tresemme number 3 medium hold spray hairspray, and then the Mission Models acrylics paints on top of that. And I did not use the poly. I find that it chips even more uncontrollably with the poly in it. So this is all just thinned about 20% like they recommend. And I felt like it worked really good. It airbrushed well. I mean, it just, you know, it's good paint. As is my habit, I sealed everything in with aqua gloss before I got on to the oil weathering, and in order to give myself a surface with more tooth to it, I just shot a coat of Tester's Dull Coat lacquer on top of the aqua gloss to give me a nice flat coat for weathering, and then went at it with my usual oils thing. And in fact, I've done a separate video that I have yet to finish and publish that gets a lot more specific about how I did the oil paint rendering. But basically, you know, I just tried to do as much of Rinaldi's recipe for it as I could, and I think it turned out pretty well. And then I locked everything in again with another coat of Tester's Dull Coat. The tires, I'm pretty pleased with the way the tires came out. The way that I did them was a base black that was like, I don't know, 10 or 15% white, just to give it a kind of a grayish look to it. Then I hit it with hairspray, did a lighter gray on top of that, and chipped it, and then came back with MIG's Earth product, which I thinned a lot with mineral spirits to get it to really kind of flow in and around everything and give me a kind of a real variety in how the dirt look settled on there. So because I wanted it to kind of collect in between the tread blocks, which I should mention too, on these resin tires, they actually come with the tread blocks just way too tall. I'm not sure what happened with them there. I mean, they're just kind of out of. It's not so much they're out of scale; they're just kind of wrong. I've never seen even a brand new tractor tire with tread blocks that were as tall as these resin ones were. So I sanded them down for that reason, but also because I did want them to have a slightly worn look to them. So you can see where all the corners are all kind of rounded off. But other than that, I really like the LZ molded resin tires for this thing. They're obviously much easier to work with than the vinyl ones, and the fit on them is really good. Didn't have any issues with that. The kit parts drop right into them, and they're not that expensive. So I mean, to me, it's an absolute must-have if you're going to build this kit. The other add-on that I got was the Yahoo instrument panel, which I was not quite as thrilled with. The look of it, like all of Yahoo's instrument panels, is fantastic, but the engineering was a little shaky. You can probably tell there that it's 2 layers because it's got the piece that has the actual gauge printing is separate from the front-facing piece, which is nice because that makes it easy to paint it and chip it. But what they want you to do is it's actually a larger piece that is supposed to be bent so that it follows the profile of this hood piece right here and extends underneath here. The problem is that the place where they would have you bend it essentially runs right through the bottom of that placard, and I didn't want to ruin that. And I also did not want to. I feel like there was really much use in having that piece on the bottom, especially given that it wasn't going to fit flush. So I just chopped it off, and I really probably should have spent more time on this. You can see that it doesn't fit super flush right there. It doesn't fit flush at all. But the only way to solve that is to actually grind the plastic out of the back end of the hood so that you can recess that down inside there. And I really should have done it, but I was just kind of at that point where I was just like, meh. I just didn't feel like it. And so, yeah, anyway, that's that. But I do feel like it was a good decision to chop off the bottom section of it. It's not quite perfect down there at the bottom. You can see it hangs down a little bit, but I think the overall effect is good enough. Most people are not ever going to see this as close as you guys are on my video camera. Anyway, I think that about covers everything with the tractor. Whoops, camera's having a little ball head problem there. I need to tighten that up. Anyway, I think that about covers it with the tractor itself. So let me get on to the Vignette Base. This is a really cool thing that Bill West, one of our good contributors on Scale Modeler's Critique Group, recommended to me. They call these art boards, and they come in different sizes, but it's basically this sheet of 1/4-inch high-grade plywood on top of a wood frame. And it works great. I mean, and they're not expensive. I think they come in a 3-pack for like $30, I think. And it made it really nice to create a base that was about the right size for this. Almost too small. You can see things are pretty cramped in there, but I felt like it was going to be okay. This back piece is another artboard thing that I found on Amazon, and I don't remember the name of it, but if you look, it's got a really nice texture on it that I felt was not only really handy because I didn't have to paint it, but it kind of duplicated what might be a sort of a rough plaster texture on the inside of a wall. So I liked it, and it comes in a 4x6, so it was automatically the right height. Wait, no, that's not true. I did chop some off the bottom. It was a 6x6. I think that's right. Yeah, 6x6. And I cut it down to like 3.5 or 4 inches tall. The only kind of issue there with it was, and you can see this right here, it was just slightly wider, even though it was nominally 6 inches, than the base. And I ended up having to trim a little bit off of one edge, which was a real hassle because it was like 50 thousandths of an inch I was trying to remove from the one edge. And without a table saw, that was a real pain in the butt. But anyway, got it done, and that gave me what I felt like was a pretty good base. The concrete floor I did, basically it's just gray Stynel res that I then attacked with various layers of mineral spirits washes, some pigments, some pigment fixers, I did do some sponge painting on it, where I went with various shades of gray that I thinned a lot with alcohol, and just, you know, randomly worked that all around to give the concrete a kind of a dappled look before I came in with the stains and the dirt. You know, the first time actually the stains were not really that good. I used alcohol thinned ink to make my first set of stains, and they just didn't come out quite right. And I kind of knew that, but it took the guys on SMCG telling me that they looked terrible for me to decide to fix them and come back with mineral spirits stains, which worked a lot better. I mean, mineral spirits, you know, it's basically just diesel, and so it behaves the same way that same kind of substance would if it was, you know, spilled on a real concrete floor. So between Tamiya's black Panaline wash and some oil paints and MIG's fresh engine oil and MIG pigments, I got what I feel like is a pretty realistic representation of a filthy concrete floor. Even down to over here, you can see where I've got a little bit of a wet drip into the dirt that's collected around that oil drum. So I was happy with the way that came out. But, you know, it was just proof that sometimes you really do need to take a second shot at it. Don't just settle for the first result. Anyway, let's move on to this compressor. This compressor is the one that came in the Italeri German field maintenance crew kit, most of which, as I talked about in the first video, is just really pretty terrible. And this compressor is kind of stupid looking, but I worked with it enough that I felt like it came out okay. It is supposed to be a gas-powered compressor, so I just chose to kind of make it like, you know, this is some kind of war surplus thing that's just, you know, rusted and leaky and beat to hell. And you can see that all of my, you know, paint finishing was towards that end. I added a spark plug wire there in the top of it. I used a little piece of photo etch mesh. Maybe you can see it on the back there for the outlet of the exhaust pipe. I made a different pressure gauge. You can kind of see there and then I punched out a piece of white decal paper to make the gauge face, and just kind of made the hash marks with a 0.5 millimeter black ink pen. The hose is just lead wire that has been wrapped around like a knife handle to give me a kind of a coiled look. And the way that I paint those hoses, and this applies over here to the cutting torch as well, is what I do is I mix up the paint, and the Mission Model stuff works really good for this because it's kind of thick and goopy when it comes straight out of the bottle. But I just put a little bit of it on a flat surface, and then I just grab the wire and some tweezers or my fingers or whatever, and then lay it in the paint and put my finger on top of it, and then just pull the wire through, and that paints it. And then you may have a little excess that you have to wipe off of it, but you'll get a pretty nice even coating, and then you just hang it up and let it dry, and then you coil it and shape it however you need to. And I've found that I can get away with very few chips because the paint does stick to the lead wire pretty well. And, you know, so if I have a few touch-ups, it's no big deal, but I don't think I had any that I had to do on that air hose. Obviously, I needed an air chuck, and so I made that from scratch out of some stretch sprue. Got some little brass tubing there for the end fittings on the hose. The jack and the jack is also from that same Italeri kit, and yeah, you know, it's not quite right. It's a little too tall, and it's some kind of thing that came on German tanks, but it's a jack. Obviously, it's a jack, and so I think it helps tell the story. The only other stuff that I used from that Italeri kit were the bench, which worked pretty well. Some of these little boxes, this case of green tools, or whatever, you know, whatever they are right here. I used that. I used these two drums. And then I used the oxygen bottles and the cart. The oxygen bottles are pretty nice and well scaled, and I like them. And the cart is okay. The wheels are kind of cobby looking, but what's really kind of goofy is these regulators. They're just way overscaled. They're just way too large. But I didn't feel like scratch building any because they were just close enough, and so I went ahead and used those. Again, same trick on the gauge faces where I just punched out some white decal paper and then just drew in the hash marks and the needles and so forth, and it's not too bad. I had to scratch build a torch because the Italeri thing doesn't come with one, so I just drew on my many years of experience with actual cutting torches and made one out of about 15 pieces of styrene rod and brass tubing and silver wire. Anyway, that was a little bit of a project unto itself, but I feel like it came out pretty good. It's a little crooked, but I think it works. And then again, the hoses are just lead wire and some chain that I got from I forget where, but it's a little heavy. But the shape of the links are right, and that's what's most important to me. It doesn't look like a necklace like some of these chains do. Anyway, scooting back over here to these barrels, I had a lot of fun painting and chipping that big oil drum or gasoline drum, because we've got one exactly like that on our farm that we used for gas for years. And so that was a lot of fun. I modified the pump a little bit and then added a hose to it, just so it was obvious what it was. The jerry can and the dump can are from the Italeri kit as well, but I added the handle that I made out of wire for that dump can. The oil drum needed a spigot, so I made that out of some little bits of styrene. But everything else there is basically stock from the Italeri kit. That oil can, however, that's sitting on top of the green box, that came from the Diopark set. And there is so much cool stuff in the Diopark set. I couldn't even believe how cool it was. I mean, when you look at these little tools, they are just fantastic. I mean, you can even read the Diopark logo on that crescent wrench and on that pipe wrench. I mean, it's even got threads molded into the screw on the C-clamps. You get that little set of gloves there. I mean, it's just super cool. The oil can over there came from the Diopark kit. That really nice vise came from the Diopark kit. So I don't know how readily you can still find that thing. I was told that they are out of business, but man, I just love it. I feel like it's one of the smartest things I ever did in model making to go and buy that, because those little tools are just so great and so much better than the ones in the Italeri set. I felt like the workbench needed a coffee cup and a dirty rag. So the coffee cup is scratch built. I actually just used the paint cup from one of the stupid looking little paint spray guns in the Italeri thing, where I kind of hogged it out and made it into a cup, and then I made a handle out of some sheet styrene and added on there. The coffee, is just MIG fresh oil. And it's a little concave there, but I think it looks the part. The rag there next to the repair manual is just tin foil, aluminum foil, that I folded up to try and look as much like a rag that was just kind of tossed there as possible, and then painted that kind of faded pink that shop rags are. The shop manual there is just something that I printed from a JPEG I grabbed from the web, and that's also what I did to create these posters and this tap drill size chart thing, which I thought was really cool. That's a really common thing. I always had one in my shops, so I like that. And then these other things are just the same thing, JPEGs that I brought into Photoshop and sized appropriately and then printed. Now they are a little bit thick, and I experimented with thinner paper, but I found that I just could not get as crisp of a print on the thinner paper as I could on this sort of medium weight matte photo paper. And I was running that through, I've got a really high-end photo printer, does a really good job, and lets me get up to like 5600 DPI, so it's really good at creating super sharp prints, which was good when I wanted some decals to make some stickers for that oil can down there under the bench, and then the one that's on the oil drum. And so I just did some self-printed decals. That's on the World paper, decal paper that I use, which, I don't know, I've had mixed results with it. It's thin enough, I mean, it lays down pretty well, but I have a hard time keeping the edges from curling up, and you can kind of see on one edge of that SO sticker that it's kind of curled up, and I just feel like, well, you know, hey, it could happen. I'm just gonna leave it. But I am on the search for a better decal paper, if any of you guys have any suggestions, because, you know, having those edges curl up is just not acceptable. Let's see, is there anything else? I feel like I've just ripped through all of this stuff super fast, but there was kind of a lot to cover because there are so many little details and nooks and crannies on this thing. But I think that's about it. I mean, it was just really a lot of chipping, a lot of oil paint work, a lot of staining, just, you know, pigments, just everything that I love, all of my favorite stuff, and that just made it a lot of fun, and I feel like that this is the kind of project I want to do more of, because it definitely kind of got me out of the funk that I had been in from just grinding on stuff that wasn't getting any closer to completion. So anyway, that's the story. Okay, so there you go. That is the story of my little story that I was trying to create there. I hope you guys felt like that was informative and maybe gave you some ideas for doing something similar yourself. I think it kind of goes to show that a diorama or a vignette or whatever you want to call it doesn't have to be really complex. You know, you can tell a story with very few elements, and even with something simple, you can really get down a rabbit hole with adding little details and extra things that help bring it to life. But I feel like it's a lot of fun and it's a good creative exercise. So I will probably be doing more of these, at least at some point. Anyway, that's that. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and as always, if you've stuck with me this long, I totally appreciate it. Thanks again. Much love.